A series of vicious fights broke out in the crowd. ACDC said no, so we can recognize them. We flip it over, and fans had to be hospitalized from beatings that occurred during a show in Sydney. Hey, welcome to the Audio Mover channel. I'm John Hadfield, and that is from an article in a Circus magazine from 1981 about ACDC during this period of dirty deeds done dirt cheap. Now, this was a kind of a strange time for a lot of us because, as you know, if you're about my age, you remember Back in Black comes out, you hear this, it's amazing, you become a fan of ACDC. For so many of us, this is the first time we ever even heard of them. And then, not long after that, this comes out. And it was kind of confusing with a different singer and kind of a different sound. Anyway, this article goes into this time period, what happened, why they did it, and if you're an AC/DC fan or if you're familiar with that time period, I think you're going to find this really, really interesting. But before we jump into that, let's go into our rock trivia challenge, and we've got 3 AC/DC questions and see how many of these you can answer. Okay, first one. What band did Brian Johnson sing for before joining AC/DC? Sweet, Cactus, or Geordie? Okay, question number 2. What song appeared on the Australian release of Dirty Deeds, but not the international version? Was it If You Want Blood, TNT, or Jailbreak? Okay, last question. Who was the original singer for AC/DC? Dave Evans, Rod Evans, or John Farrar? Okay, pause the video, go down below in the comments, put whatever answers you know, and then at the end of the video, we'll tell you the correct answers to these questions. All right, let's jump into this article. I think you're gonna find this super, super fascinating. AC/DC were easily one of the most popular outfits of 1981, and their acclaim increased as the year wore on. Pretty good for a group that didn't do anything. Now, this is kind of fascinating because when you look at the time period, as I said a minute ago, it was a little bit confusing for a lot of us because what happened was Back in Black came out in 1980. And I was in 6th grade at the time, and I remember hearing this the first time. I think it was a friend of mine, his parents got it through Columbia House or something. All I know is that I went over to his house and we put this on because we wanted to listen to it. And I still remember hearing the count off to the song Back in Black, that ch, 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 oh my gosh. And then those bap, it was like chills. And here I was like an 11-year-old kid and I still remember what that was like. It was so, so powerful. And then, early the next year in March of 1981, all of a sudden this comes out. And then you have a different sound and a different singer and it's awesome. But it was, again, a little bit confusing. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have all this information. We're kids. And so, like I said, they say that they didn't do anything that year, and it's true. They put out this album that was actually released years earlier, but they did at the end of 1981 release something, and it was this. Okay, let's keep going here. Aside from releasing a 5-year-old album in late March, which is this one right here, work on their new LP with producer Mutt Back in Black Lang kept AC/DC confined to the studio until year's end. Hardly the sort of visibility that makes for a flourishing year. But back to that 5-year-old record, which is what they're talking about here. Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, recorded in 1976, had never been available in North America. In Europe and their native Australia, it was their second LP, falling between High Voltage and Let There Be Rock. The disc was hardly an ancient artifact, however. Although the lineup was different, Bon Scott, who died in February of 1980, was the vocalist, and Mark Evans, replaced in 1978 by Cliff Williams, handled bass. The sound differed little from that on Back in Black, the multi-platinum album, which marked the debut of Scott's replacement, Brian Johnson. I would love to hear your feedback on this. What they said there. They said, even though this is 6 years old and they're just releasing it, it's not all that different than this. And I don't know. That would be a great discussion. I would love to get your feedback, though, how you compare and contrast these two. Obviously, the voices are very different. But from a stylistic standpoint, what do you think about that comment? I'd love to get your feedback on this. The full frontal assault and staccato crossfire of guitarists Angus and Malcolm Young hasn't changed much over the years. And Scott's gin-soaked voice was probably even better back then than on his final LP, Highway to Hell. Love to get your feedback on that too, because I tell you something, I got it out too. Here's Highway to Hell. This, of course, was the final Bon Scott album. And I got to tell you something. Was Bon Scott not just the most awesome thing? This came out in 1979, basically a year before this. We've done a video on this on the channel before. I love this cover so much for one very specific reason. His huge smile. Even though the songs, and you know, the rest of these guys, they have kind of this gritty rock and roll thing to them. Bon Scott was just always positive energy. And you look at the old footage of these guys playing together back in this era, all this stuff before Brian Johnson joined the band. Nothing against Brian Johnson, by the way. I love, especially Back in Black, he's amazing. But there was something really special about these two on stage. You had Angus that had this kind of energy and this chaos that was around him. And then you had Bon with the swagger and the positive energy. And it was just infectious. He was just amazing. Anyway, this was his final album, Highway to Hell, in 1979. So here we go. The 9 songs on Dirty Deeds reprise the trademark ACDC themes, titles like Big Balls and Love at First Feel, except for 2 tracks previously heard in the States, Rocker, a live version of which appeared on If You Want Blood, You've Got It, and Problem Child from 1977's Let There Be Rock. Dirty Deeds could have easily been construed as a brand new AC/DC record, exactly what the band was afraid of. This right here is super fascinating, what they have to say. Of course, their record company was more than eager to get out this desirable property that had been selling as an import at prices ranging from between $15 and $18. As a spokesman for Atlantic Records explains, we went to the group and said, there's a demand for this album. You're not going to have product for a period of time. Let's put this out. AC/DC said no. This, to me, is incredibly interesting. Because here they were. I mean, think about this. Here they were, 1979. They put out Highway to Hell, which is just awesome. But it was in February of the following year, basically like 7 months later, Bon Scott dies. They replace him pretty quick. This album comes out. This is 1980, July of 1980. And this goes absolutely crazy. Selling millions. You remember what it was like. This was everywhere. The songs were incredible and it was selling millions of copies. So then they get into 1981 and they're looking at this going, we're not going to be putting anything out probably till the end of the year. You know, they're planning on putting out For Those About to Rock. That's going to come out later. And the record company has got to be thinking right then, wait a minute, you're telling me we've got all these other things in Australia. This was never even put out in the United States. What are we waiting for? Then they went headlong into releasing this album because they saw this as, you're selling millions of copies of Back in Black. AC/DC is everywhere. They're hot. Everybody's talking about them. This is the time to put this album out. And then the guys in AC/DC are thinking, whoa, wait a second. You know, the record company's saying, we can make so much money right now. People are just wanting anything by AC/DC. They don't even know about this album. Let's put this thing out. And AC/DC, like it says here, says no. And this is interesting why. Listen to this. The band objected because it was fearful of fans mistaking Dirty Deeds as the new AC/DC album rather than the missing AC/DC album. A problem solved by slapping on a sticker that clearly stated all selections recorded in 1976 by, and went on to list the members. AC/DC were satisfied, almost. And of course, they're cognizant of the problem this could cause, the problem that happened with people like me. Because you become a fan of AC/DC, and then all of a sudden this comes out, and you don't know what to do with it. It doesn't compute, it doesn't make sense, and we didn't have the information. We didn't know. You know, I mean, little by little things would filter around, but you remember what it was like. The group also felt that since it was an old album, it shouldn't list at $8.98. So, as a gesture toward their millions of fans, the company announced in April that Dirty Deeds would be discounted by 10%, making both band and fans happy. That's pretty interesting. And by the way, I'm curious if any of you remember this. Now, I wasn't really actively buying records at the time. Again, I was 11 and 12. I was in 6th grade. But it'd be interesting for those of you that were, and you remember buying this, and you remember this, and do you remember that period of time when they were even discounting it? I don't remember anything about this. I just remember kind of living through these songs and experiencing these things the first time. Within 10 weeks, Dirty Deeds streaked past the 1 million mark, reaching number 3 on the record charts. And if one song dominated FM radio in spring of 1981, it was the title track. As always, AM stations passed on the band because of its lyrical crudity, despite immense sales. Click on a radio anywhere, and chances were that Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, a rollicking rocker with a nasty message, would come on soon enough. And by the way, that's really an interesting thought, because isn't that maybe even still true? I don't listen to classic rock radio much as I used to, but boy, it seems like whenever I have had it on, it's pretty common still to have Dirty Deeds come on through the day sometime. I mean, they're playing ACDC all the time, of course. But this song, Dirty Deeds, for me, ended up being one of my favorite go-to ACDC tunes. It's absolutely incredible. It's fascinating to think about that this thing, came out after Back in Black. It was this thing that had been sitting around for years, and then you find out, wait a minute, this is awesome. And the music on this thing, especially that tune, Dirty Deeds, was, to this day, it's just so incredible. Oh, by the way, and then look at these. These are such great pictures. Do you remember what this was like in the early days of Brian Johnson? There was something, he wasn't like Bon. Bon had his own kind of unique swagger to him, the coolness, the energy. But there was something about Brian Johnson too that was great for this band, because he felt a little bit like an everyman, like a normal guy. And when you just look at these pictures of him with the t-shirt and the blue jeans, and you just go, yeah, I don't know what it was about him, but he was just cool. In Detroit, notorious for liking its rock and roll hard, the song was an instant hit. Very definitely, says Greg St. James, music director of WABX FM, the first time you'd play it, the phones would light up and people would ask, what's that song? Play it again. I'm curious how many of you had that experience, not just with ACDC, but you remember what it was like listening to the radio and all of a sudden you hear some song and go, what is this? And then sometimes they wouldn't tell you. And then what are you doing? What's the number to the station? Calling the station, hoping somebody will pick it up and tell you what that last song was. But anyway, he's talking about that right here, that they start playing Dirty Deeds, and people are going, what is this? Again, and it was like AC/DC said, there's a little confusion in there. This kind of came out of nowhere. Okay, even in cosmopolitan New York City, and even on WNEW FM, the city's most progressive and sophisticated rock station, the track was a frequent repeater. Dennis Elsas, a mainstay at the station who works the 6 to 10 p.m. shift, has this explanation for the phenomenon of an old LP learning new tricks. That's what this was too. Quote, the timing was perfect because the group was so hot at that point, coming off the Back in Black album. They're a very good hard rock and roll band, and there was a void there for that kind of music. They filled it. Dirty Deeds was the right sound at the right time. And this is such a fascinating thing to think about this, because this Back in Black was such a juggernaut. It was so powerful that it created a demand for that sound, for that thing. And that's why they hey, let's throw this out. And then it sold like crazy. And I want to know how many of you had this experience. When I was, as I said, going into 6th grade, this was released the summer before I went into 6th grade. And I remember this experience. I'm going into 6th grade, AC/DC, and this music is everywhere. It's so cool and it's so amazing. And then it's toward the end of 6th grade that this shows up. And this is what happened to me. And I'm curious how many of you went through something like this. Some kid brought this in to music class. And again, this is near the end of my sixth grade. You'd have music class and the teacher would say, okay, on Fridays or whatever, they'd let you bring records in and play some song. Well, some kid, not like right after this came out, brought this into music class. And so we listened to 2 songs off this album, and I'll let you guess, what do you think the 2 songs were that kid wanted to play off this album? Of course, Dirty Deeds was one of them, but any guesses on what the second song would have been that this kid would have wanted to play? Of course, Big Balls. But I still remember, it was kind of silly and funny and we were all laughing, but the song, especially Dirty Deeds, was so great. And I remember being in there. And like it said there a second ago, it was the right sound at the right time. But even so, even though that was true, the record company wasn't convinced that it was the right album cover. And this is a whole nother story, because this, of course, is the international release album cover. The original album cover from Australia has that drawing. You've probably seen it before. And it just, for some reason, they didn't think that was maybe going to fly in the United States once they printed it. So they went with a tried and true company, which was this organization called Hipgnosis. And they're the ones that put this together. Now, Hipgnosis, of course, was legendary at this point. They had done so many famous record covers, going all the way back to Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, which might be the most famous record cover ever. Of course, that was them. So they put this together, Dirty. And I remember, the reason I remember this is when the kid brought this into class, I remember seeing this too. And it was kind of fascinating. Like, what am I looking at? I saw these people here with these black bars over their eyes. And of course, as a kid, I'm thinking dirty deeds. I'm wondering, are these the victims? Are these the people that are getting taken out or something like this? They would do this in real life. They'd put black bars over people's eyes because the eyes are the things that we recognize people through. These are the things that would hide their identity. Putting something over somebody's eyes kind of short circuits the brain's ability to recognize facial recognition. So they put these black bars over these people's eyes. And I always thought this was pretty fascinating, looking at this group, this kind of strange, almost random looking group of people. And then the other thing that was kind of funny when you look at this is that they threw a dog down here. Just looking at this recently, it made me think of another Hipgnosis album cover. It's this one right here. Similarly, just threw this dog on there. And I don't know if it's the same kind of dog or not, but they have the same, when you look here really closely, they have the same patterns on the face, the same colors, and even the chain, when you look really closely down there, same kind of chain. So you look at these people, they've got these black bars over their eyes, so we can't recognize them. And you think when we flip it over, what they could do is remove the black bars so we can recognize them. We flip it over and they remove the people and leave the black bars. There, the exact same location. Anyway, it's kind of a little tongue-in-cheek, a little funny, playing on this whole idea. This hotel, this is the Imperial 400 Motel. It was such a great image that they picked because it does have that kind of seedy feel to it, especially when you look at this parking lot, all the oil stains. It just feels like the place that you would find the dirty deeds, whatever kind of people. And so what they did is they were in Los Angeles. They took this picture of this motel. They went back to England, which is where Hipgnosis is based. They took these other photos of these people, and then they started putting them in here. And Hipgnosis has this specific style on a lot of their images. And as a matter of fact, this is a great example of it. Not just the dog, but you can see, when you look really closely at these pictures, you can literally see where they're cut out. And even on these images, you can see it really, if you get really close, you can tell that these things are cut out. And that's why they have this kind of weird surreal look to them, because everything's kind of in focus the same way. And that's how they kind of get this. They all have this kind of look to them. So anyway, so this was kind of an interesting thing. And like I said a minute ago, it was fascinating being alive at that time and living through this, because when this comes out in 1980, and we all saw this, and it had this ACDC, and it's all embossed, and even back in black, it's just embossed. There's no ink on this that sets it apart. So it's this very almost classy looking thing. And then you have this that looks a little bit old and dingy. And that's partly why, getting back to what they said there, they were concerned that fans would think that this was just the new album, and not realizing, no, this is an old album. And for a lot of us, and I'm curious if you went through this too, at first that wasn't clear. And then you would learn this over time. Now, one other thing that's kind of interesting about this album cover, when you look on the inside here, they kind of continued the theme of the covered eyes. And so they have the guys in the band, and they did the same thing with the photos. But I'm going to show you one other little detail that will probably get overlooked by most people, and it'll be dismissed a little bit, like most people won't care, and it isn't a big deal. It's evidence that they rushed this. Now keep in mind, like we said a second ago, Back in Black came out in 1980, and it's selling like crazy, and the record company goes, wait a minute, there's more stuff we can just release. Get it out. We could make so much money. People are talking about ACDC. Let's do this now. Here's just a little bit of of an example that shows you that this was rushed. When you look at each one of these songs, like right there, Squealer, and you'll see basically a double space, and then you have the lyrics. Same thing, right on, double space, lyrics. There's going to be some rock and double space lyrics, same, ain't no fun, same thing. By the way, I'm going to learn you something really quickly. These extra spacing, originally it was called leading. And because back before we were doing all these things on computers and they would put all these little things in there by hand, all the little letters, they would put little pieces of lead to space so that they would have different types of spacing in between words. So anyway, that's the technical term, and some people still use it, leading, for the spacing. Okay, now let's flip it over and check this out. Same thing right there, Problem Child, and look right here. These two songs, this is not correct. And although Dirty Deeds is lined up with Rocker, they have several extra spaces there and several extra spaces there. Is this a big deal? No. But there's no way they did that on purpose, where they pick these two songs and, hey, let's put a triple space on these two and make it different than all the others. No. If you're a graphic designer, this consistency is an important thing. You want to have consistency in situations, in things like this. And like I said, I believe this is just a little bit of evidence of they were rushing this thing out. The QC process was a little bit weak. They just said, get the things on there, get the information, go, get it printed. And somehow as they were going through quality assurance, and they just missed it. If they did recognize it, they were probably at the printer. I've done this before. And you start printing something and you look at it and you go, is that a big enough deal for us to worry about right now? And a lot of times, no, just keep going. Greg St. James agrees. The timing couldn't have been more fortuitous. Look at the way the whole thing worked out. First, they get a hot product with a new lead singer, Back in Black. And then they release a 5-year-old LP with a singer who's since died. And it becomes almost as big as the new product. A scriptwriter couldn't come up with something like that. And by the way, isn't that the truth? I mean, when you think about Brian Johnson coming in, brand new singer, replacing a legendary singer. And instead of maybe losing a little or just at least trying to maintain, they take it and it just becomes the biggest thing they ever did. To this day, that's still their biggest album. It's one of the biggest selling albums of all time. It's just kind of almost miraculous that it worked out the way that it did. You bring in this new singer and it just explodes beyond anything they could have ever imagined. It's absolutely incredible. And of course, it's amazing too, and that's part of the reason, because he was so great. Those responsible for that script are now getting ready to work on the sequel, with ACDC satisfied with the promotion of Dirty Deeds, and Atlantic no doubt thrilled by the 2 million plus sales. Both feel that everybody came out ahead. Although ACDC originally questioned the strategy, Atlantic was confident about the LP all along. We didn't have any doubts when you sell 5 million copies of your previous album. Come on. And that's a good point. But really also the important thing is, they're thinking of it in terms of, hey, we sold all these copies of Back in Black. Of course, this is going to sell. But let's be honest, this is really good. And it is good enough to merit some amazing sales like that. So there really is something to that. As it turns out, AC/DC weren't totally surprised. In a rare press statement, they told Circus magazine, no, we weren't. We always knew it was a great album, and we're happy that our fans feel the same way. Although it's only been in the last 2 years that their audience surpassed the 1 million mark. Even in AC/DC's early days, their fans comprised a small but rabid gang that was attracted not only by the music, but by the group's semi-serious glorification of debauchery, beginning with Scott's leer and tattooed body, and the star of the show, Angus. Now that, again, like we said a minute ago, those two together on stage, how do you beat it? It was so great. The semi-serious glorification of debauchery. There was something serious and tongue-in-cheek about everything they did. And that's why Bon, huge smile on his face all the time, because the music was fun. While Young, born in Glasgow, Scotland, will be 23 on his next birthday. That's not true. He's actually going to be, he'd be 26. His onstage capers, which include a striptease and a quick flash of arse, will probably keep him eternally youthful, at least in the eyes of AC/DC fans. Quiet and soft-spoken off stage, he's an unlikely rock hero. Yeah, and that's really funny. They'd keep him eternally youthful, especially now, looking back at where we are right now, and this is one of the reasons I love doing this channel. You go back and read this stuff. They don't know the ending of the story like we do. They don't know where this goes. For those about to rock hasn't even come out yet. And here we are 40 plus years later, and we get to see, yeah, this would go on for a long time after this. It's amazing what they were able to accomplish, that even to this day, after these amazing records that they put, I don't think they ever did anything as good as Back in Black ever since, but still, they put out so much great material that even to this day, all the decades later, they can still pack a stadium. It's absolutely incredible. Singer Brian Johnson is an even less likely star, a burly 33-year-old ex-roofer from Newcastle, England. Lurching about the stage like a woozy prize fighter, Johnson isn't so much the bad boy that Bon Scott was, as he's merely a likable bloke. It would seem that the days when ACDC were trailed by the British Vice Squad, to make sure we weren't up to any mischief, smirks Angus, are behind them. And as I said a minute ago, there was something just kind of awesome about Brian Johnson, because he just really did feel like an everyman. But even now, they can involuntarily inspire violence. During a homecoming to Australia, where the band formed in 1974, a wave of destructiveness greeted them. One concert was described by the local press as the loudest, wildest, and most violent rock event ever. In Melbourne, a second performance was almost canceled by police after a series of vicious fights broke out in the crowd, and fans had to be hospitalized from beatings that occurred during a show in Sydney. There was a happier side to their return, though. After the latter show, ACDC were awarded 4 years' worth of accumulated gold and platinum discs, including posthumous plaques for Bon Scott. From there, it was into the studio, where they ground out the rest of the year. And like I said, when this magazine came out in December of 1981, although when the magazine came out, For Those About to Rock was out, the articles and interviews are done months ahead of time. So they didn't know, and they hadn't any, For Those About to Rock hadn't come out. But that's why they're talking about they were in the studio the rest of the year, because of course they were working on this, which was the follow-up to Back in Black. And I got to tell you something. I love this album. I don't think it's as good as Back in Black, but man, it is good. And just the song For Those About to Rock, We Salute You, in my opinion, it's still one of the greatest songs that they ever did. It's so spectacular. If AC/DC could achieve such fame in 1981 with no touring until mid-November and some recorded leftovers, which is what they're, talking about here, imagine what's going to happen next year when they're on the road behind the new record. Even Gene Dixon could probably predict this one right for 1982. Look for AC/DC to be at the top of the hard rock heap once again. And little did they know, AC/DC would be on the top of the hard rock heap. I don't know that they'd ever really leave it. They'd put a lot of albums out that a lot of people would, but they had so much great stuff, and they were consistent, and they were fun, and the music was great, and it was just always awesome. All right, let's get back to our rock trivia challenge and see how many of these questions you got right. First question, what band did Brian Johnson sing for before joining AC/DC? Was it Sweet, Cactus, or Geordie? The answer to that question is, of course, Geordie. Next question. What song appeared on the Australian release of Dirty Deeds, but not the international version? Was it the song If You Want Blood, TNT, or Jailbreak? And the answer to that question was Jailbreak. And we wouldn't hear that in the United States for a few years after that. And that's actually a great tune. It's a really cool tune. But there was some concern about the topic and whatever, and if it would be appropriate, and so they didn't put it on. Okay, last question. And before we do this last one, please go down below, hit the like button. If you're not following the channel, come on, please follow the channel. And we'd love to get your comments down below. Do you remember this time period? What was it like for you? Do you remember, like I do, when this came out? And then the little bit of confusion, like, what is this other stuff? And then also, like me over the years, I've grown to really, really appreciate, even though I was introduced to it with Brian Johnson, I've come to really appreciate and sometimes maybe even love the Bon Scott stuff a little bit more these days. It's so amazing. Go to digitech.com, check out all the latest gear and technology. We want to thank them for their ongoing support of the channel. And whenever you go to digitech.com, do us a favor and let them know that the people at Audio Mover sent you there. All right, last question. Who was the original singer for AC/DC? Was it Dave Evans, Rod Evans, or John Farrar? Now, John Farrar, that's kind of a throwaway. I put him in there because he worked with Olivia Newton-John, Australian, thought that'd kind of fit in there. But then Dave Evans, Rod Evans. Now, the correct, you've heard both of those names as the first singers of rock bands, but only one of them is with ACDC, of course, and the one that was with ACDC was Dave Evans. Now, but why would you have heard of Rod Evans before? Rod Evans was the first singer for Deep Purple. So the answer to that question for ACDC, Dave Evans. And with that, have yourself a fantastic day.